Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and in today's video we've got a really fun and exciting holiday project for you. We'll be turning the German smoker. It's an extremely popular German tradition, and these are a really fun decoration you can put out during the Christmas time. The great thing about turning these projects is they're extremely scalable and you can tailor it depending on your ability. So you can turn more of a basic, simple profile like this guy, or if you want to get really creative and you've got a lot of extra time, you can do something like this, where we've painted the face, we've added some hair, we added decorations to his hat, and then painted on his lederhosen. I think this one looks really, really cool myself. But the great thing is, depending on wherever you're at in your turning level, you can scale this project down to fit your needs. The cool thing about these is in the kit, it comes with the brass wire for the pipe, it comes with the incense you use to burn to get the smoke, and it comes with a nice little brass cup to keep everything as fireproof as we can make it. That's also going to contain that incense from keeping it from tipping over. But let's light this guy and we'll show you exactly what it does. We'll just light the incense, and once we get a nice little flame on here, we'll blow it out so we don't have a torch on the inside of the body. And then it's just going to emanate smoke from the mouth and give this nice decoration a lot of life and character to it. Alright, so once we get that incense lit, you can see the smoke coming off of it, and then we'll just put our guy right on top of there, and the smoke starts coming out of his mouth, giving this guy a ton of character. I just think these things are super, super cool. The other nice thing is because it's burning incense, it's a nice seasonal scent to it, and it adds a nice little extra layer to your holiday decorations. So let's get to the lathe. We'll cover the materials that we need for this project, and we'll start turning. Alright, so we're at the lathe and we're ready to turn, but before we start, let's talk about our blank selection. For this project, I'm going to be turning a Santa Claus themed smoker, but depending on the style and shape and size that you want, you can adjust your measurements according to the size of smoker you want to make. So this is going to be the smaller block for the feet or the leg section and the base. That's going to hold that incense cup and a little burner piece. And then this is the block I've got in my chuck right now. This is for the main body, and I'll be turning the head and the body of this all out of one piece. If you wanted to have the head be separate from the body, that's up to you. So yeah, roughly 3x3 by 7.5 for the main body section. That's going to give us a little extra room to put tenons on this for reverse chucking in the drilling process. And then the smaller one is roughly 4 inches. This one's about 1 inch longer than I need, but I can always save this extra piece for a jam chuck later on down the road. So the first thing we need to do, we've got this blank, this is a square blank in our chuck jaws, and the way this is currently sitting, this is not a great hold. We want to have a tenon on there. So I will be roughing this half to round and throwing a tenon on to fit these 2.5 inch chuck jaws. The tools I'll be using in this video, I'm deviating from my normal tool set because I'm trying to get better with my skew. So I've got an 1 inch, or sorry, 1 1/4 inch and then a 1/2 inch skew that I'll be using for the bulk of our turning process. And then I've also got my 3/8 spindle gouge. Those are going to be the tools that I'll be using in the video, primarily just because I'm trying to get more time with my skew to get better with it. Otherwise, I would be normally starting out with a spindle roughing gouge just to get that material out of the way quicker. But I want to rough with my skew. Show you guys some different angles, different cuts you can do with the skew. But let's get this thing turning. So I've got my tool rest actually above center height. I find on these larger diameter pieces, on those planing cuts, I like to have my tool rest a little bit higher than normal for a spindle roughing gouge or any of my other tools. I've got my tailstock engaged. That's going to give us nice support, especially with this length of block. But let's start turning. Give that a quick spin by hand. I've already tightened my chuck jaws. Make sure you have eye protection, dust protection, and make sure you're safe when you're turning. So we'll start this at 0 and then we'll bring this up to speed. A really long square blank like this that's not held securely in the chuck, only on those corners. I don't want to have this thing turning at max speed. That's why we started at 0. We're going to start turning roughly about 1400 RPM. So with this wider skew, we'll be using this to do our planing cuts and roughing cuts. And whenever you're using the skew, we always want to make sure we're working basically from the center of the tool down, depending on the direction, if you're using the short point or the long point of the tool. So we'll be using the short point for this roughing process. So I'm going to stay about halfway and then down to the heel. That's going to be the edge that we're using to cut. If I engage above that center line where that dust is, that's going to give me a really bad catch because that leading toe edge here is going to dig in and kick back really hard on me. So I always want to make sure we're on the bottom half of that tool. The biggest thing with the skew is making sure we have bevel contact before we engage the cut. If I go in there and try and engage that right on the cutting edge, it's going to catch on me. So I always like to start with that handle nice and low. We're engaging the bevel, you can hear it. And then I like to raise the handle, and then we can start our cut. We'll do a little more in-depth skew video later on down the road. So this is kind of a quick overview on the skew. But again, always on the bevel. And then we'll start picking up that cut. About to the point where we need to adjust our tool rest. Once we start getting about a 1/2 inch or bigger gap between our tool and the tool rest, the risk of injury goes up significantly. So we always want to make sure our cutting edge is supported as close to the work as possible. But you can see as we're doing those planing cuts, as we hit these end grain fibers right here, it's kind of peeling up the fibers, but we'll be turning that away, so it's not a big deal. Let's go ahead and get our tool rest just a touch closer. But again, just to make sure, we always want to be cutting on the lower half of the blade here. As soon as I lower that and get it flat to the tool rest and start cutting on this top half, it's going to kick in and bite. So again, make sure you're on your rest. We'll start on our bevel contact first, then we'll lift the handle, and then we'll start getting that cut. If you want a masterclass video on how to use a skew very efficiently, check out our Monaco videos. Matt Monaco, we have a few videos on using the skew, and he is a wizard with that tool. Also, the Allen Batty we have gives you a really good kind of a precursor entry-level skew video on how to use it effectively. Once we've got this close to round on this end, we're going to start getting our tenon sized. So I've moved over my tool rest, and right now we're going to be doing this is called a peel cut. So I start with that handle low, and this tool is flat on the tool rest. It's not propped up at all like we're doing for our planing cuts. I've got this nice and low, and then we raise the handle to make our cut. All right, so that peel cut's going to give us a really quick way to get our tenon established, and you can see we have that proper dovetail profile on there. However, the downside to a peel cut is it tears out those end grain fibers really bad, and I just don't like having torn fiber anywhere. So what we can do is we'll throw a nice little slice cut with our skew, and that means we're going to be bringing this thing almost vertical, but we're just going to have that just a couple degrees off of vertical, just enough room basically to put a playing card in between the bevel, the top of the bevel here, and the edge of the wood here. If we go perfectly straight up and down or past straight up and down, this thing's going to catch and have a serious mark into our piece, and we don't want that. So if anything, start with that bevel leaning a little further away from that edge here than you need to, and you can always just bring that back until you get the cut and pick it up. So one of the tips I picked up from Monaco is just putting a nice little chamfer here. That gives you a good entry point for that skew for a slice. But the biggest thing is I want that bevel nice and straight in line with the direction of the cut I want to go. And then making sure that my bevel has just a slight gap to it between the wood surface and the top edge of this bevel. So let's see if that was enough to get rid of our tear out. Depends on how deep the tear out in the wood goes. But that cut that nice and clean. I'm also just going to square up the bottom of our tenon with a peel cut here. Sometimes, depending on how long your tenon is, you can bottom out on the chuck jaws, and if that's not nice and straight, it's going to make the piece crooked in your chuck. Just going to clean out the torn fiber right there from our peel, bring that into our corner, and that's going to be a really nice dovetail. And this is going to maximize our working hold with our chuck. Because this piece is so long and unsupported at part of the turning process, in just a little bit, we want to make sure we have a really nice, properly formed tenon to maximize our working hold with our chuck. Now that we have that sized correctly, let's go ahead and flip this thing around. Make sure you seat that up against the face of the chuck jaws, and then we'll clamp down onto this nice and tight. Now we can bring up that tailstock for a little extra support during the roughing process. Anytime you're turning, if you can have that tailstock there while you're turning, it's always a good call. It's going to keep the piece nice and secure. Bring that tool rest back just a touch. Make sure that clears. Early on in your turning process, I'm sure a lot of guys have started their lathe and it hits the corner of their block and knocks it out of the chuck, or it kicks their tool rest down, and we don't want to have that happen. So just make sure you spin it, make sure everything clears well, and we can continue. Again, we just want to make sure we stay about halfway down the tool and we're cutting on this lower half of our cutting edge. That's going to make sure that we don't have any catches. Bring up that tool rest, make sure it's nice and close. And I don't want to go on too long with the skew, but you can see the radius profile I have on this. The reason I like the radius profile versus just a straight edge is as I'm making these cuts going across this piece, and I'm right about here in the middle of the lower half, I guess the lower 2/3 of this piece, the bottom heel of the tool is not going to be digging in and raising and curling out those end grain fibers. Because I've got that nice sweep on there, the very bottom heel of this tool is out of my way and it's not digging in. So, I don't know what kind of skew you guys have at home, but if you haven't tried a nice radius sweep on your skew, throw that grind on there, give it a shot and see what you think. Again, we want to make sure we're on our tool rest, make sure that tool's anchored, then we start with that bevel, and then we can engage the cut. We're getting pretty close to round. My tool rest is just a little shorter than I'd like. I usually like to have about 1 inch or 2 of run out on my tool rest after I stop engaging the cut, instead of getting to the end of my cut and then pretty much falling off the tool rest. So having a little bit longer tool rest would be kind of handy right now. But the great thing about the skew is it leaves such a clean surface behind. And you can see the shavings we're getting off this. We get nice curls. That's down to round now. Now we can start working towards our chuck. Again, we're anchored, we hit our bevel, and then we start the cut. Again, make sure you stop before you run out of room on your tool rest. Okay, now we're nice to round. We'll move over our tool rest. But as this piece sits in our chuck right now, this is going to be the top. This is going to be the head of our Santa Claus, and this is going to be the base. So we're going to have a nice tapered body to it. I want to maximize the diameter of the piece that I'm working with, so I don't want to turn this down too much more. We do want to clean out any torn fibers or anything before we get our final size on the base here. But let's keep roughing this down just a little bit. Okay, so you can see this process would be significantly quicker if we were using our spindle roughing gouge. It would save a lot of time, but I am trying to get more time with the skew and just show you some tips of using the skew as we're doing this. So first thing we need to do now that we're to round and we've laid out kind of the top and the bottom of our piece, we want to clean up the bottom here because we will be using a Forstner bit to drill out the majority of the body and allow that to have good oxygen flow for the incense to burn, as well as make sure we have enough room that way, because we do have an open flame inside the body of this guy. We want to have enough room and volume in there where we don't have direct flame on wood contact on the inside. So make sure that whenever you're sizing this, you can scale it down a fair amount, but you will just have to drill it a little bit deeper, which will limit the contour and diameter you can get on your piece. So let's go ahead and do a nice little peel cut here on the end, and then we'll clean it up with a slice, and then we can grab our Forstner bit and drill this out. Now that we're around and we have a really good hold on our chuck, we can also bring up our speed. We're about 2,000 RPM now. The thing with the slice cut as well is you do need to make sure that surface is flat. If you're trying to do a slice cut and this thing is a little bit crooked, as that outer round piece comes around, it bumps the bevel of the tool and pushes it out of the cut. So you really can't get a clean cut on an uneven surface with a slice. You can do it with a spindle gouge because usually you're cutting enough material off at a time. You can get underneath that out of square face, but with the slicing cut, you're taking off such a thin amount at a time, you really don't get below that uneven surface. So now that we have that flat, Let's go ahead and throw a small chamfer on here. Like Monaco says, we want to keep the blood in the veins. So we don't want to have any sharp corners we can get cut on. I start with that handle low, engage just the tip of that point. Start that over just a little bit, take a wider pass. Sometimes when you're doing that slice, I don't know if you guys just saw it, but there was a big piece of a shaving that got stuck between the bevel of the tool and the wood, and then it just basically binds and pushes that tool out of the cut. So if that happens, just stop and then start the cut again. And again, we've got that top edge of that bevel just a few degrees off. And you can see this little nub here we have on the bottom, that's too thick a material to try and slice off with our skew. So at this point now, we can move our tailstock out of the way, but you can see we've got some bevel rub marks, but we have a clean surface as far as the tear out goes. I'm gonna bring that tool rest over just a few degrees, give me a little more support for my spindle gouge, just to get that larger material out of the way. And we're also gonna drop that. That way the nose of our spindle gouge is right on center. We are unsupported with a fairly long blank, so we want to make sure we have appropriate tool control, and we're taking a nice light cut. Getting a fair amount of vibration just because we're putting a lot of leverage on a piece this long, unsupported. But now that's ready to drill with our Forstner bit. I'm actually just going to throw a small little dimple, help our Forstner bit find its center point. And then we'll grab our keyless chuck with a Forstner bit. Forstner bit I'm using is 1 3/4 inch. Depending on the body size and shape dimensions you're using, you might need to go with a little bit smaller, or you can go bigger. But we'll get that seated in the Morse taper. And we'll bring this up, and we want to drop our lathe speed down. I know this bit is a little bit dull. I don't maintain my Forstner bits as good as I should. And I know this is probably going to be a fair bit duller than I'd like. But we want our speed around 500 RPM. And we can start drilling this out. Back out the bit, make sure you clear the shavings. A lot of times those shavings tend to bind up inside the body, and it creates more friction on the Forstner bit. And it can, especially in these keyless chucks, the bit can start spinning, or this can come unseated from the taper as well. So make sure you clear those shavings out. Let's talk about our design here for just a second. So this is the base piece with the little brass cup. That's going to be sitting in there holding the incense, and that's going to be on fire, so we want to make sure we have at least 2 to 3 inches of space from the top edge of our incense to the face on the inside of our blank. Depending on your dimensions, if you can't get that length in the body itself, you can always recess that cup down, and that'll give you an extra 1/2 inch. If you drilled out the base and lowered that cup into it, that'll give you a little more room for that incense. Let's keep drilling. I think we're about there. I just want to make sure I'm about at the face of my keyless chuck. I'm going to go just a touch fast just to give myself a little extra room. I'd rather be on the safe side and have more room in there than have too little room. If you do turn one of these and you have your incense in there burning, and you notice after a couple of uses the inside edge on there, on the inside of the body here, has burn marks on it, that means there's not enough room in there between the incense and the edge of that wood. So you might need to readjust where your cup sits for the incense. Okay, so we've set that 1 3/4 inch Forstner bit off to the side. Now we need to drill basically a chimney for that smoke to come up through the head, and then we have to drill that exit hole as well. Right now what we want to do is lay out how long we want the body to be, where the head's going to be. That way we can drill our 1/2 inch hole for the chimney, for lack of a better term, to the right depth. I don't want to over drill this and then start turning the head and end up with a giant hole in the top, or have it be too shallow and not have a hole for the smoke to come out. So what we can do is, I think the base of this is pretty good. I'm going to undercut that rim slightly just so it seats up against the base a little better, but our overall length isn't really going to change. I think overall body length, that looks pretty good proportionally. And then the height of the head, I'd say we go about there. So what we need to do is we want to make sure that we have this drill bit drilled basically to the center of the face. So this is going to be the head. All right, we're doing a Santa Claus face, and the hole for the mouth is going to be drilled from the side, and then we're going to have that 1/2 inch hole like this. That's going to allow that smoke to come up and out of the face. So what we can do now is we can put just a small mark on our drill bit, and then we can seat that into our keyless chuck on that mark. And I'm going to go just a little deeper than my mark, but I can drill that. I can fit this keyless chuck a little bit further into this hole. So once you have the Forstner bit hole drilled out, now we're drilling the chimney. And again, we keep that speed nice and low. Again, backing out the chips frequently is extremely important. As that bit gets hot from the friction, it expands a little bit, squeaks really loudly with the wood, but that's fine. So as you can see, we're going to have the body here. This is going to be our head section. That's just kind of an illustration of our chimney vent for the smoke to come out. But we can set our bit off to the side now. And before we flip this around and remount this piece on our drilled hole, I want to make sure that this surface is slightly undercut and cut really clean, as well as sanded, because we won't have access to this end of the piece once we're on our other jaws. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to use my spindle gouge. Just take a nice couple of really light cuts because we're got a lot of leverage with this piece. And I'm just going to slightly undercut the rim here. I'm going to start about halfway in and just take out some material. Again, I'm starting on that bevel, open up the flute just a little bit to engage the cut. One thing I don't want to do is come in here with that flute too open and have that left edge. That's going to dig in really bad, and it's guaranteed to throw this piece out of our chuck jaws. So if anything, just close that flute over more than you need. Make sure you're on your bevel contact, and then you can open up the flute until you start seeing shavings. And then we can keep on working this down. I'm going to bring my tool rest over just a hair. Once we start getting out to this outer edge, there's nowhere for that bevel to be supported, so I want to make sure that flute is entirely closed until the very lead edge of that nose bevel has support. The majority of the catches with your spindle gouge are going to be right on the edge because you're trying to make an entry cut and that bevel has no support. So we have to make sure that flute is perfectly closed, which means it's at the 3 o'clock position, and we're cutting with that nose basically straight up and down like a knife, like the slicing cut with our skew is. So that surface looks a lot cleaner to me. I'm going to bring my tool rest over so I can use my skew to give myself a small chamfer on the inside edge. Just going to my 1/2 inch skew, and we're just going to kiss that surface using it like a negative rake scraper, giving us a small chamfer on there so we don't have a sharp corner. Let's go ahead and move our tool rest. I'm just going to lightly sand the bottom of this. This surface is cut super clean, so I'll start with 240. Actually, I think we can try starting with 320. This surface is extremely clean. There's just some marks from the bevel rub, but the fibers of the wood are cut extremely clean. Nice and smooth, and we will be dyeing this piece, so I'm not worried about any of that little bit of a discoloration from our bevel at this point. Once you have it drilled, you've laid out your project, depending on the size and scale that you'd like, and we have our surface cut nice and clean here, we can take this out of our chuck. We'll be switching to a smaller chuck with the pin jaws. That way I can expand into it and hold that piece. That way we can get the shape we need now that we've done our drilling. But if we take a look at the inside of this piece, so you can see we've drilled that about 3.5, 4 inches deep, and then we've got that 1/2 inch drill bit all the way down to the head where it'll allow the smoke to come out of the face. So nice clean surface. Let's get our smaller chuck with the pin jaws, the extended pin jaws. All right, so let's go ahead and put our VM100 chuck with the extended pin jaws. We'll put this on our lathe, and this is what's going to be used to hold the body of our smoker here. If you don't have these jaws, I know these are a little expensive, but if you don't have this set of jaws and you don't want to buy them, you could always use a waste block in your regular chuck, turn basically a dowel to fit that as a friction drive, and then you could support that with the tailstock for the majority of the turning. But that's one way of getting around it. The reason I like using the jaws over that jam chuck method is I want to be able to turn this unsupported at the very end to get the head round and make sure I can get a clean cut there and not have to saw off a little nub. However, with this project, because we're putting a Santa hat on the top of this, if there was a nub there or any torn fiber from the handsaw or something like that, it would be covered. But let's go ahead and get our keyless chuck out of the tailstock. We'll bring up our cup center. And I want to make sure I have a little bit of a gap here between the face of the jaws and the end of our blank, because I do need to clean this surface up a little bit. Normally I would run that all the way to the face of the jaws, but I'm going to be leaving this just a little bit sticking away from the jaws just so I have a little bit of clearance. And then we'll use that revolving center to find that center mark we had. And it should be running nice and true. Yeah, it's just a hair out around, but because now we have clearance, we can true up this end here and then start working the shape that we need to. So now that we're running true, I can just tighten this up a little bit. I don't want to get too crazy expanding into this recess. As we get this a little bit thinner and smaller, you have the risk of, having it crack the blank. So you don't need to get crazy with that tension. And then we're just going to give it just a little bit of tension with our tailstock as well. If I crank down on the tailstock, it's going to push that further down on those jaws. So just enough support for the turning process, but not too much. If we look at our drawing we had on here, we've got that hole drilled through the middle with the little exit chimney here. And this is about the overall height of this piece I want to have. So I'm just going to go ahead and mark a nice line all the way across so I can see that. And we'll part this extra section off here in just a bit. And the nice thing is this has a tenon on it, so I can reuse this later for other projects as a jam chuck. So again, I've just got a box of those I keep around. That way I don't have to waste good material for a jam chuck. As far as our turning process now, it's time to start shaping the body, getting the head profile you want, making sure the amount of body to head proportions are what you'd like. So let's just start getting some material out of the way and we'll start getting the shape that we need. So I'll be using my narrow parting tool. This is the nano parting tool. I'm just going to cut a nice groove in there to give myself that mark of where the end of the blank is. And I'm going to go just 1/8 of an inch past that mark, just so I have a little extra room to work with. That's going to make it nice for me having that groove in there. That way I can start shaping the head. I've got that clearance now. We'll be using that spindle gouge. Make sure we get on our tool rest, anchor, bevel, cut. Make sure the tool is anchored on the tool rest. We find the bevel, and then we can pick up the cut. I'm just going to round this over here just to give myself clearance for the tool. When I start shaping that head, if I leave all that bulk of the material in the way, as soon as I start rounding that over, I'm going to be contacting my wings on that excess material here on the waist block. So having that nice little taper to it, now it gives me access to start shaping the head. The diameter of the head needs to be smaller than the body, so I think what I'll do first is start shaping and getting the diameter of the body where I want it. Then I can do a couple peel cuts with my skew to get the head to the diameter that I need. I'm going to raise up my tool rest just a touch for this skew, and we can start doing some planing cuts to start getting the taper on the body that we want. I'm just going to lightly plane the surface, clean up that outer round. We'll come from this direction and work towards our chuck. And again, we want to be on that bevel, and then we can pick up the cut. And I don't want to take a lot of material off here. I just want to skim the surface and clean it up and make it back and make it running nice and true. Okay, that's running nice and true. Again, we look at the skew. Those planing cuts leave an extremely clean surface behind. That bevel burnishes the wood and gives you a nice clean surface. We still have some tear out there from before, so I'm going to have to go down just a little bit further just to clean that up. We were a little aggressive with the skew when we initially roughed and some of those fibers tore out on us. But we should be able to clean that up no problem. Getting a really fine shaving off the skew. I sharpened it before we started shooting the video today, and we're getting really fine shavings and a really clean surface. All right, that tear out's almost gone. There's just a little chip there, and once we put the dye on, that's gonna stand out like a sore thumb, so I wanna make sure that this surface is immaculate. One thing to note with the skew is it is a very, very tricky tool to learn how to use and control it and use it effectively. And making sure that it's sharp is gonna make it easier on you. Trying to learn the skew with a dull tool, it makes it so much harder than it needs to be, and is gonna be more prone to catching because you're pushing so much harder than it needs. But let's go ahead and take a look at our surface. That looks nice and clean. So I think what I'll do now, we'll start getting that taper on the body. As far as our body shape, it's gonna be something very similar to this. We're gonna have that nice shape on the body, we'll have the head. I'm not turning a hat because I do have a Santa hat that we're gonna glue on along with the beard. So we're just gonna be turning the body and the head out of the one piece at this time. Start getting the shape I want with the body. Again, make sure we start with that bevel first, then we can pick up the cut. I'm going to use a couple of peel cuts just to get this material down because I don't want the head to be that big or large in diameter. And I think the height of that head is just a touch longer than I like for the proportions of the body. So we might just make the body a little bit longer. As we hit those end grain fibers there, they tend to peel a little bit. But that's just fine. We can use a slicing cut just to get through those. Slicing cut takes a really thin shaving, so you have to do a bunch of cuts to get through, you know, depending on how much material you have there. And I don't want to make our body too skinny. This is going to be a Santa Claus, and he's fairly portly, so we want to make sure we keep a fair amount of mass there just to get the right aesthetics. But you can see as that cut's going into those end grain fibers here, they kind of tend to peel and curl up. But we'll do some cleanup cuts. We'll do a nice little slice there. That's going to give us a really clean surface. We'll neck this down just a little bit further here, and then we can start shaping our head. But again, as we're using that skew, we're anchored on our rest. We contact bevel first, and then I lift that handle a little bit till that cutting edge on the lower half starts engaging the cut. You can see the bevel marks there. I'm pressing just a little bit harder than I need to, just because I'm trying to rough this out a little quicker. But let's do a nice cleanup cut. I'm really happy with the diameter we have here. I just want to refine the surface. So I'm riding the bevel, but I'm not pressing really, really hard. Just nice, even pressure. I'm going to use the long point down now to get down into that corner. The problem is if I try to use the heel at this point, that tool's in a really weird position for me and has a lot higher likelihood of a catch. So I want to use the long point down. So we'll flip that over again, anchor, bevel, cut. Start on our rest. I'm on the bevel right now and I lift the handle until we're cutting with the long point of that skew, and that's going to get that long point down into that sharp corner. And that's going to give us a cleaner cut as well. And just a little bit easier to get in there than trying to use the heel of the tool. I think we need to make this just a little bit smaller diameter here at the neck. And I think the head needs to be also a smaller diameter. And then we can start shaping that. And there we go. I think that diameter of the neck now looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and start shaping the head. I'm going to bring that tool rest over a little bit, and then I'll do some peel cuts just to get to the diameter, starting diameter that I want to be at for the head. I think that looks pretty good. And for the head shape, I like to use the spindle gouge. For me, it's a lot more controllable when I'm trying to get a nice rounded, you know, this is essentially a bead, just a larger bead. But for me, the spindle gouge is a lot more controllable, and I don't want to have a really bad catch with my skew right now because I just don't have the material there to cut that catch out of the material and then still have the right size diameter head that I need. So I'm going to go to the tool that I'm a little more confident with at this time. We'll start shaping. And then I roll that over and close that flute right as we get down to the shoulder. When we're meeting these surfaces and it's a really steep curve on each side, down in a groove like that, as we're rolling that bead, that flute starts nice and straight up, 12 o'clock while we're on the bevel. And then as we're rolling that bead, we're closing that flute as we go across, and we end up with that flute completely closed at 9 o'clock on this side of a piece. And if I was working this side, it would be 3 o'clock. The reason we end up at the 9 o'clock flute position is that way we're cutting right on our nose. If I have that, and I have that flute slightly open as I get down to the bottom of that groove, this lead front edge of the nose would dig into that piece right there, and we'd have a pretty nasty catch. So we always want to end up with that flute completely closed, cutting right on the nose like a slice. The shape of the head's looking pretty good. I think it's still probably just a little big. So let's remove some more material. I'm going to grab my parting tool again. I'm going to cut that channel down at the top of the head just to make it a little bit thinner and give myself more clearance. I'm going to do a peel cut too. That way I've got room for that spindle gouge to make the cuts that I need to. If you need to, we can switch to this side and get your body in the right position to make the cut. That's a little heavy of a cut for the how much pressure we have with the tailstock right now. So I'm just going to back that off and take just a little bit lighter pass and then work that down. You can see as I'm getting to the very top of the head, back here on the flute is contacting this face right here. That's preventing the tool from going where I need it to go. So that means we just need to get this material out of our way. Just round that over, get rid of those sharp corners. That way if I touch them, I'm not going to get cut. I'm going to move that tool rest over now. I'm going to bring that up a lot closer. These 3/8 spindle gouges don't like it when you're, more than an inch or so over the rest. Once we're, about halfway across the tool, we start to get a lot of chatter and a lot of flex out of the tool. Just continue that curve around, see if it's the shape that you like. So I'm happy with the shape of the head. I think it's still just a little bit too big in diameter. All right, I'm liking the shape of that. I've got a little bit of a tall, kind of a high spot right here, so I'm going to pick up the cut midway down and then continue that spherical shape. The great thing about shaping the head is it doesn't have to be a perfectly round ball. It can be kind of a flatter pumpkin shape, I guess, to it. Going back to the skew, I want to get a finishing cut on this surface. That way we can start sanding with a little finer grit. Ultralight bevel contact. I don't mind if I get burnish marks off the bevel. We're just trying to minimize that bevel contact but still maintain tool support. I'm just trying to refine that surface. That feels a lot smoother. Got to soften that up just a little bit right here so we can pick up the cut on our bevel. Okay, that surface feels a lot better. I'm going to finish that cut down here with the spindle gouge, bringing that down into the shoulder. So we'll pick up our bevel, bring the handle around till we start seeing shavings. And then we'll take that all the way down and close the flute as well, so that way we have that nice transition line. All right, so I'm just going to bring my tool rest a little bit closer. That way I can get good support from my parting tool as I bring the diameter of this waist piece here down just a little bit. Whenever you're using your parting tool as well, you want to make sure that that tool is nice in line with the cutting edge. You never want to try and part really from the side, especially if you're doing a plunge cut with it, because then it can bind up and catch on the top edge of your tool. So we want to make sure that tool is nice and as straight as possible. And we'll take that waist section down to about a 1/4 inch diameter. And once we get our head finished shaped, we get rid of the excess material here, we can finish parting off this waist block. Once we do that, we can shift the whole thing down onto the chuck face, and hopefully it'll be running true enough that we can do a couple cleanup cuts where the parting tool left that little nub behind. But I'm going to finish cutting here on the top of the head, and then we'll sand as much of it as we can while it's still supported with that little waist section. So we'll get back in here with our spindle gouge, and because that section is so small and it's not a lot of support, we want to make sure we take light cuts. If we have a catch right now, we probably are going to break that, and then this piece won't be running true anymore. So we want to just take small bites, and you can see that we're contacting the bottom edge of the flute here up against this waist block. So we'll do a couple cuts, a nice little skate there. Make sure you have your flute closed. If you don't have it closed, it'll skate on you like that. So we'll do a couple cuts here just to give ourselves clearance. I've been surprised a few times doing very similar shapes like this where I'm rolling a nice sphere, and then I'm not really paying attention to where that flute is in contact with whatever waist section's in the way, and you have a nice catch and you realize what you're doing wrong. So we'll pick up the cut again. We're going to continue this around and get that nice rounded head shape we're looking for. Still need a little bit more room to work. Just get rid of more of that bulk. I think we might still contact that just a touch. I think that's good though for what we need to do until we part that off. So let's move our tool rest out of the way. We'll drop our speed down to our sanding speed. All right, so let's start sanding. We've dropped the speed down. We should be able to start out with about 240. Anytime you're sanding, make sure you're wearing dust mask. I've got a little air filter thing on the floor, but normally I wear a dust mask anytime I sand. All right, so we're just done sanding with the 400 grit. Let's stop and just inspect our surface, make sure we're ready for the dye application. And that surface is looking really clean. No tear out, clean fibers, nice and smooth. But now that we're at this point, we're ready to part off our waist block, and then we can finish turning and sanding the very top of the head, and then we can start our dye application. So let's bump our speed back up. I'm going to just ease off the tailstock pressure slightly. I don't want to have a ton of pressure on this as I go to cut that little waist section out. If you have too much pressure, sometimes it can cause those fibers to break out really deep into the fibers here in the head or whatever project it is, and then you never really have enough room to turn it out, because sometimes those fibers will pluck out a good 1/8 of an inch or so. But I'm just going to support this by hand as it comes off, and we'll use that nano parting tool just to cut through. I'll back up that tailstock slightly, and then this we can save because we have a nice tenon on there. We'll throw that in our parts bin. All right, now that we don't have tailstock support anymore, I just want to make sure that this is still nice and snug. Make sure that hasn't loosened up as we've been turning. We'll bring our tool rest around because we're going to be cutting right here on the end of the head where we have those torn fibers. And we want to be extremely gentle with this because we don't have a face, a mating surface between our block and our chuck jaws. These things are only held on by those expanding jaws. So if we get too heavy-handed, we're pushing too hard on our bevel, it can shift it on the jaws slightly. So we don't want to have that happen because then the piece won't be running true anymore. So we'll go back to our spindle gouge. I need to lower that tool rest. We had it just a bit higher for the skew. So let's go ahead and lower that. Now our cutting edge is going to be right about center. But I'll start on my bevel, and then we'll pick up a cut with the nose of the tool, taking just small little bites at a time. You can only be as aggressive as your work hold will allow you to. If you have a really bad work hold and you try to be too aggressive, your chuck is going to let you know that it doesn't like it, and it's going to send that block across the shop. So if you're ever unsure of your work hold, if you're not too confident in the tenon or the mounting method you've used, just take light cuts. Generally, if you're doing something that's going to cause an accident, it generally makes a lot of noise and lets you know before the piece comes off the lathe. If it starts squealing or vibrating, or you're getting a ton of chatter, that's kind of the lathe's way of telling you, hey, whatever you're doing isn't working, so you got to change things. But we were able to cut those end grain fibers there nice and clean. There's still just a little bit of a bump that I don't want to have to sand out. So we'll take just one more pass. And saying one more pass is synonymous with either 10 more passes or a catastrophic catch. That's usually either way that it goes, but that surface is cut nice and clean. So let's go ahead and finish sanding that, and then we'll start putting our die on the body. That spindle gouge left that surface really clean. I'm going to try sanding it with 400 to start. Anytime you're sanding a rounded surface, use the palm of your hand. That helps that sandpaper form to your shape that you've got instead of creating a bunch of micro flat spots. If I sit there with my thumb or a different object to hold the paper, or even a disc holder that's too firm, you'll be sanding and it's going to create a bunch of little facets on the end of your rounded surface. So we're going to move our hand around using our palm, and that's just going to help us contour the top of that head and give us a nice smooth surface. This is ready for die. Let's clean off the lathe bed, get rid of any extra dust. I want to have this as dust free as possible before we put our die on. Alright, so now that this is sanded, before we apply our die, we want to drill the chimney holes and the mouth hole for that smoke to come out. Drilling those before we're done sanding, that way if the drill bit does tear out any of those fibers, we're still in a position we can clean those up and make those look nice and crisp. So let's get our drill bit and we'll drill the chimney holes for this. And once that's done, then we'll be able to throw our die on. So for the drill bits I'm using, anytime I'm drilling on a rounded surface like this, I like to use the brad point bits, but for the chimney hole, we need to have plenty of airflow for that incense to actually smoke. So this bit is actually, we'll be using a 7/16 on the bottom one here, and then for the mouth hole with this size of head, we're using a 21/64, but that's just due to the size of this project. The other ones I did are a little bit smaller, so I used a smaller drill bit for the mouth hole. I think I used 1/4 inch, but just tailor it according to the scale of your project. However, the holes do need to be big enough to allow airflow for that smoke to come out and that incense to burn properly. Let's start out with the bottom hole here. I'm going to actually pre-drill this with a smaller bit with the brad point, and then we'll go back in with the larger bit. And I'm just going to lay this out depending on where I want the chimney hole. We have to remember with the base, one thing to keep in mind is we have about a 1/4 inch tenon that's going to recess into the body right about here. So I need to make sure that chimney hole is above that and allowing that adequate airflow. So if we're about this far and then towards the head, we should be just fine. And depending on your grain orientation and any figure that you might want to have be the front or the back of your ornament, I think we'll do right about here. So I'm just going to do a small little pencil mark where I want that drill bit to be, and then we'll do the same thing with the mouth. And we want that to be, so this is going to be the back side, and we want to make sure that the mouth hole is on the exact opposing side. I think that's going to be low enough to give us enough room to paint the eyes and the face and have a little nose. I think that's going to be a good spot for it. Just double checking that's exactly opposite of where the back piece is. So that's just on that edge of the forejaw. If we flip that around, we should be moving this over just a hair. Match that up. All right, so with the larger one, that's not a brad point bit, so I'm going to pre-drill this. And if we need to, because we still have our chuck jaws in there, I'm going to rotate the blank on the chuck and just make sure that I've got that drill bit going into the gap between the chuck jaws so I don't hit those. On that initial entry cut, we want to make sure that we're nice and easy on the pressure. That way it doesn't tear out the fibers on the surface. Okay, that cut really clean for us. I'm gonna get the drill bit, the larger one. I wanna get this drilled in there about halfway, get that started while it's still in the chuck, and then I'll finish drilling it on the lathe bed. Kind of tore out those fibers there just a little bit. If you have a bigger brad point that size, that's going to give you a cleaner cut. Now that I've got that halfway through, let's take this out of our chuck so I don't hit my chuck jaws, and then we can finish drilling that by hand. All right, so I'm just going to tighten up my chucky so I can turn again. That bit really tore out that surface and I'm not happy with it. So what I want to do is I'm actually just going to turn this lower 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch, just taper that down a little bit, try and get underneath that tear out so we have a nice crisp hole there. This is a little risky because we're not registered against the face of the chuck jaws and we don't have our tailstock for support anymore. So this might go well or this might go horribly wrong. And we're going to find out in just a minute. So stick around. I remounted this on the chuck jaws, took just a few seconds just to make sure this thing was running as true as I needed to. The head is a little out of round, but that's fine. But where I'm going to be cutting is actually running fairly true and true enough for what I need. But the key here is going to be really, really light cuts. I have a very poor work hold method right now, and we're just trying to save this piece and just clean it up. So let's get back to our skew. We'll do a couple planing cuts and see if we can just get underneath that tear out and have that look a little better. Very light bevel contact. Pick up our cut. And I'm not pushing towards the chuck jaws at all. I'm just letting this tool glide across that surface. We're getting a very fine shaving though. That's going to leave us a really clean surface. Let's stop the lathe and take a look and see what we've got going on. Okay, it is minimizing that. There is a fair amount of material that we have to get underneath to clean that up fully. So let's keep doing some more cuts, making sure we're just nice and light pressure. Again, anchor bevel cut. I'm on the tool rest, I'm on the bevel. And that knocking noise we're getting is just because that piece is ever so slightly out of round. And it's kind of kicking that bevel just a little bit and you can hear it knocking. These are the kind of cuts you want to avoid when you've been in the shop already for 5 or 6 hours and you're getting tired, because this is when you really need to focus on tool control and light cuts. Okay, that's looking significantly better than it was before. Let's do just a few more passes, see if we can get underneath that. And if we can't get underneath that, because those fibers are torn out all the way down through that, we're not going to be able to clean that up at all. There's not enough material. But I do just want to make sure the outside edge of this drilled hole is a little bit crisper. Okay, let's go back to our sandpaper now and just blend between the area we just turned and what we had already sanded. Again, drop that speed down. We'll go back to that 400 grit. And let's take a look. Okay, that looks significantly better than what we had before. That tear out split all the way down the middle of that blank there. That's not going anywhere, but that's what happens when we're doing demos. So let's go ahead and drill the mouth hole now. And I'm going to lock the spindle because I don't want this shifting on me as I'm trying to drill. So we can just rotate this piece on the chuck itself. Again, we're using that brad point. That's going to give us that center point. Nice and slow. Let the bit just ease its way through that wood, especially at the very opening, because we don't want to have a repeat of that lower hole there. Once we're into the block, we can go a little bit quicker, but we don't want to be pressing that drill bit too hard. I don't want to go through the other side. Okay, that cut nice and clean. And I went through, I could feel the pressure change as soon as we got into that 1/2 inch drill hole running this direction. So now we can set our drill bit off to the side, and then we can just sand up this surface if it's a little rough. And because this isn't running true now, because I shifted it on the chuck, we'll just do this part by hand with our 400 grit, just to soften it up. And that's going to be the body done as far as the turning steps are concerned. The next thing we need to do now is we do need to dye the bottom half of this blank. And before we do that, I want to get a paper towel. And I want to get as much dust off this piece as possible, so we'll just use some denatured alcohol to clean up the surface of the wood here. We'll let that alcohol flash off for just a moment, set our rag off to the side to dry as well. And for the dye that I'll be using for the body, I'll be using the chestnut red. It's a nice, really bright red, or you can use the artisan red. But I'll be using the chestnut for this guy. And then we'll also be using some of our markers we sell. These are just a red marker. That's going to allow me to get down in there where that neck groove is and get a really fine, crisp line between the natural wood and the dye. It's very difficult with a rag to get up into that really tight groove we've got here without getting dye on the head, and I don't want that because it's going to look really weird, and then we'll have to sand it all away. So I'll just turn this on at low speed, just let that alcohol flash off. So you definitely want to wear some rubber gloves when you're applying the dye. This stuff will stain your hands for a few weeks. So we'll throw our gloves on, and we'll start with the marker. The marker is going to give us a nice border between the head and the neck, and then we can start using the rag for the rest of the body. So when we use the marker, we want to drop that speed down nice and low. It's easy to overdo it with the speed on these markers and cause the markers to either break off or dry out too fast. So we want to go nice and low on our speed. And I'm going to be using my tool rest, here for just a little bit of support with the pen. That way I don't slide too far to one side or the other. As I'm using the marker, I like to rotate it just to keep that marker nice and wet. That way it doesn't dry out. Okay, I'm happy with that. That gives me room now to work with the rag. I'm actually going to go just a little bit further. Rather be safe than sorry. That way I keep that dyed rag away from the head because I don't want to have to sand all that dye out. And with the end grain fibers right there, chances of me sanding that out are very slim. So where I'm trying to be fairly precise with the application of my dye, I'm going to fold this over into a nice little spongy pad. And this chestnut dye is alcohol based, and it's a shellac as well inside. Small shellac content, but that's going to give us a really good, bright, vivid red we're looking for. If you don't have this dye, you could obviously spray paint the body. Just get a nice, good, bright red spray paint, and that would also suffice. So I'm going to just dip that spongy bit of the pad down into the dye. That's going to wick up a nice amount of dye that we need for this size of piece. Get some more dye on here. We're going to blend the areas between the marker red and then the dye red. Try and make those not so noticeable where we had that marker transition. And you want to be extremely steady as you're getting close up to the head there. But a nice few applications of this dye and you get a very good even saturation of the dye, and that's going to be a nice bright red for us. Going to get some dye down into the drilled hole as well. Okay, turn the lathe on now, and we'll just buff off any excess dye. Make sure we have good even coverage. Make sure you throw your cap on immediately so you don't knock this off the lathe. And then these dyed rags are flammable, so we want to make sure we unfold them, set these out to dry, and then we can get a nice clean rag and just kind of friction dry the surface. So once we have the body complete, I'm going to take it off the chuck and do the underside of the body. And I've taken off my gloves on the side holding the head, that way I don't get any contamination. And then we can use that same rag we were just using to just touch up the bottom. Okay, we're ready to turn the base now. So I'm going to set this off to the side, let that finish drying, getting all the alcohol to flash off, and we'll start turning the base. All right, so now that we've completed the body, we can go ahead and remove this chuck. We'll put on our 2.5-inch jaws. Now we're going to be turning the base here. So with our base block, this is just a little bit shorter. This is a 4-inch piece. This is longer than it needs to be. I would say a 3x3x3 square is going to be a good size. But let's get that mounted into our chuck. We're going to turn a small tenon for it to give ourselves a better working hold. So we can set this over here. And with the leg section here, this is the little brass incense holder. This just glues straight onto the face right there. But we're just going to be turning the leg section, and then we'll be dyeing it black. So we need to turn this block of wood into something like this. So let's get that mounted up. We'll tighten up that tailstock, and we'll give this a quick spin. Make sure it clears our tool rest. Make sure we have enough of a gap there. We're not going to contact anything while maintaining tool support. We'll grab our skews, get those back on our lathe bed, and let's start a lathe. Bring this up to speed nice and slow. We've got the tailstock and everything nice and tight. Tool rest is nice and snug. I'm going to do just some peel cuts here to get the corners off. Now we can clean up the end here, make sure that's nice and square. And then we can cut that tenon. And we're looking to match this for our 2.5-inch jaws. We'll give that a small chamfer there. I want to get this end right here down to round. Still got some flat spots. And then we can do a nice slicing cut here just to clean up this face. Whenever I do a slicing cut, I like to clean the dust off that bevel so I can see exactly where my cutting edge is going to be, because a lot of times you get stuff stuck to that tool and it kind of obscures your view, and then you can make a bad entry cut and have a little bit of a catch. So it's nice just to clean up those tools. And then we'll make sure we have a nice crisp corner down there. Get our tailstock out of the way, and then we'll mount this with the tenon in the chuck jaws. Because we have that dovetail profile on our piece and the jaws, it gives it a lot more secure working hold and is less likely to come out of the chuck. Gripping onto those 4 corners square like that, it's not necessarily a safe practice, but you can get away with it just a little bit if you're taking light cuts and you have good tailstock support. So let's readjust our tool rest. We'll bring that tailstock back into place while we finish roughing the corners off this. And then once this is to round, we can lay out the height and dimensions we need for the leg section of our ornament. Make sure it matches really well with the body. Once we get that laid out with our pencil, then we can start turning it to shape. Once we're getting close to the chuck jaws, we can flip it to the long point down. Take just a nice light cut. And then we can just do a small peel cut. And now we're ready to lay out our dimensions. All right, now that we have this pretty much to round, I'm going to remove the tailstock because we need to clean up the face right here. This is going to be where we're going to mount our brass cup. So this is the orientation of how this sits. So we need to cut that recess to fit inside the body. And we need to clean off this face really well because we will be gripping onto that to turn the rest of this. But before we do that, we want to clean off this surface, clean up any tear out, anything like that, just so we have a clean surface. So we can start with that peel cut. We're taking off just a really fine amount just to square up that surface. And you can do a slicing cut, or we can use the spindle gouge, whatever preference you have. For me, I like the slicing cut when I don't have to go over the rest a long ways. But with this one having that rest there, I'd be a good 2 inches over the tool rest with the skew. So I'll usually go back to a spindle gouge just to clean up the surface. And on that entry cut, I gotta make sure that flute's completely closed. If that's slightly open, it's gonna skate and really blow out the fiber right here. So I wanna make sure until I have full bevel support, that flute's nice and closed. Okay, that feels pretty good. Move my tool rest out of the way for just a moment. So I'm just gonna show you the way I tend to do it if I have that Forstner bit handy. Obviously you could use calipers, that's usually the best way to do it. You're gonna be a little bit more accurate, especially if your Forstner bit wasn't running true when you drilled that hole out. A lot of times those Forstner bits can start off center and then you have an elliptical or an offset hole, and it might give you a false dimension. So I'm pretty sure we drilled that nice and accurate, but I can use just the very edge of the teeth of that Forstner bit. That's going to give me my dimension I need to turn the tenon diameter down to. So just a little tip for you, that's just a quick way I like doing it. And as far as the tenon length, about a 1/4 inch or less or more depending on what you like. You can alter that depending on how deep you drilled into the body and how much space you need for that incense so it doesn't burn the inside of the wood. But let's turn our speed back up. We'll go back to a peel. Using just the tip of that skew just to peel these fibers away to get down to the dimension that I need. As you're getting that dimension, it's always a good idea to test fit with the body. Make sure it's not too tight or too loose, especially where we have extra material. If it's too loose and sloppy, I would part that off and cut a new tenon to have a good, not a press fit, but just a nice friction fit between the two. That way, if someone picks it up, the whole thing doesn't fall apart. So just give this a test fit. Make sure that goes on. A lot of times when you're using that Forstner bit, sometimes that tenon will be a little bit oversized depending on how straight that drilled out. But that's a good fit. And that tenon is going to be long enough for what we need. So we drilled that about 3 1/4 inches deep in the body. There's plenty of room for that incense so it doesn't catch on fire. So I'm happy with that. And that tenon is also cut nice and clean. So I'm not worried about the dimple. If you wanted to, you could turn that out. But because that brass cup will be glued onto that face, I'm not worried about it. And that surface is cut nice and clean. All right, so now that we have our tenon sized, let's go ahead and clean up this end grain fiber, lightly sand it. But before we do that, let's just lay this out for the overall height. I think I want to go just a little bit shorter than this leg section here. So I'm just going to eyeball where I want this rounded foot. So that's going to be the rounded base there. And then we're going to have this be the largest diameter, and then it'll taper down to this radiused foot. And you'll see that here in just a second. So let's clean up those end grain fibers. We'll do a nice slicing cut here. Make sure that bevel's pointed in the direction you want to go. If anything, err on the side of being slightly undercut. That way when those two mating surfaces meet, there's no gaps because they're cut in the wrong direction. But that looks nice and clean cut there. So let's go ahead and sand that now. About 400 grit should be just fine. Drop that speed back down. I don't want to sand the tenon because that'll change the size and shape of the tenon. That's kind of one of those things, like anytime you're doing boxes where you want a nice suction fit or a press fit or anything like that, a lot of guys will try and chase that fit a little bit with sandpaper, and it's not consistent, and a lot of times you'll go past the ideal fit and then it'll be loose. So now we can grab our narrow parting tool. I'm going to part this down to a better, just to a smaller size, so I have room to get the taper in the legs that I need. I'm also going to cut on this side as well. But let's use our spindle gouge to start getting rid of some of the material. When we're doing a long tapered cut like this that's kind of just paring away material, it's really easy to keep that flute a little bit too far open and then it skates on us. And because we're close to that final diameter that we need, I don't want to have a skate, so make sure our flute's nice and closed. We'll stop there. Now we'll start getting our bead shaped. I'm going to close my flute because I don't want to skate because it's going to pull my tool towards the chuck. Make sure that flute's closed. And we're just getting rid of material here so we have room for that spindle gouge to make the cuts that we need. Yeah, it's looking pretty good. Let's get in here and just finish rolling that bead. Checking the shape, making sure everything's looking pretty good. And we'll pick up the cut right about there, and we're going to clean up that tear out from the parting tool. Flute closed. I don't want to skate on my bead. We'll come in from this direction, just clean up these fibers. And then again, it's when I get down to the bottom of that corner, I roll that flute completely closed, cutting right on the nose. Let's check our surface. Okay, that's looking really good. There's just a little bit of a tiny bit of tear out down there in the very bottom of that corner. This surface all looks nice and clean, tenon, everything looks good. Bead's looking pretty good. I'm pretty close to the shape that I'd like on the bead. We'll do one more cleanup cut down in the bottom. Using just the nose of the gouge. Let's see if that did what we needed. Okay. That looks good. Let's go ahead and sand these exposed areas. Then we'll part this off and flip it around and remount it into our chuck. That way we can clean up the bottom. I'm not going to bother sanding the bead right now just in case it shifts or is slightly off center when we remount it. That way I still have room to turn that exactly to the size I need. Okay, now we're ready to part this off and then get that remounted in the chuck so we can clean up the foot. I'm going to give myself a little bit wider curve. One of the common mistakes I see with parting tools, especially in our class, is guys think they can make just a single cut all the way through a 3-inch blank without giving it a relief curve. What happens is as you're parting that down, you're getting further and further over the rest, that wood starts to pinch and bind on the steel, and it'll blue your tool steel, it'll burn the wood, and it'll just leave a really nasty surface. So you always want to cut basically 1.5 times as wide as the tool is. That way there's room where the wood isn't going to be binding on the steel, and there's room for those chips to clear. I'm going to get my support hand and just hold the piece and gently guide it off the block. You can see just how nasty the surface is left behind by a parting tool. We're going to be giving this a slightly concave bottom here. That's going to allow us room to cut out some excess weight in the base, as well as get rid of all this nasty tear out from the parting tool. So I'm switching now back to a VM100, but this time I've got the smaller shark jaw set on here. I found this to be a really good stopgap between my pin jaws and then just my 2.5-inch dovetail jaws. This thing should fit in there just fine. If you don't have jaws like this, you could always have drilled out about a 1/2 inch by 3/4 inch deep hole and done a dowel to jam fit into. So if you don't have the chuck jaws I'm using, there's always another way to mount it that's cheaper or free. Make sure that chuck is seated. I felt a little bit of play in something and I was like, okay, this piece is clamped in the chuck, shouldn't be loose. So just double check whether you've seated the chuck body to the spindle itself. And then as far as the pressure with the chuck jaws, I don't want to mark or leave really deep indentations from these jaws on this surface. So I'm just lightly gripping it, and we're going to take very, very light cleanup cuts with our spindle gouge. Let's give that a quick spin, just see if it's running true. It's just a hair eccentric right up here at the top. The base is actually running true. This is going to be good enough for what we need, and because we already sanded it, we don't have to touch it. And again, light cuts. Remember the ABCs? As long as we follow the ABCs, we shouldn't have a catch here. When I pick up the cut here at the rim, I want to be very, very mindful of my flute position. I really do not want to have a skate at this point in the project. If this comes out of the chuck, chances of me getting this remounted and running true again are pretty slim. And if it flies off, it's going to get dented on the floor and I don't want to have to turn another one of these. So flute completely closed until that nose has support. I've got some bevel rub marks, that's okay. I just want to make sure that that surface has no more tear out. So that looks good. I'm just going to smooth out the surface, try and get a little bit better pass with the spindle gouge, and just focusing on being a little lighter on that bevel pressure. I don't really want to be burnishing or having burn lines from the bevel of the gouge, and that's going to be perfect. So let's go ahead and sand the bead now, the base. Drop our speed. That's not as smooth as I would like. Sanding with 320 or 240. I'm going to bump that speed back up, and I'm going to use that skew just to negative rake scrape very, very gently just to smooth out this surface. You can see that surface changing as I'm cutting it. It's getting smoother and smoother. So one of the reasons I really like having this radius sweep on here is as I'm scraping across a concave surface like this, I'm only engaging about 10% of the cutting edge at any given time. Those straight across skews, I couldn't do that on this, or ones with a less drastic radius on the front. You're engaging, a lot of times half the cutting edge, and that puts too much pressure into the wood, especially when we're lightly gripping a piece. So having a nice radius on here is just like having a French curve scraper essentially. We're just contacting a very small portion of our cutting edge, minimizing how much disturbance we have to our piece. But you can see that's left a really clean surface and it's gotten rid of those ridges. So now we should be able to sand this out no problem with the 240. The surface before was cut clean as far as the fibers. There was no tear out because you cannot sand tear out unless you're going with 80 grit for about 2 hours. So you always want to make sure the fibers themselves are cut clean. If you have ridges or imperfections, that's fine. You can always smooth those out and blend them with your paper. But I've seen a lot of guys try and chase tear out of a piece on end grain fibers especially, and it just doesn't work when you're trying to sand it out. So you want to cut those clean and have a nice surface that's going to be faster and quicker to sand. Alright, for dyeing the leg section here, we'll be using the Artisan Black. So just like before, I like to fold up that paper towel, give myself a nice little pad, and then we'll just saturate this really well. This piece, with all the end grain fiber we have, will absorb a lot of dye, and we want to make sure we have a nice, even saturation. You can see that just sink into those end grain fibers extremely quick. Getting that very bottom corner of that shoulder, I like to just kind of drip it onto the piece, and you can see how fast that absorbs into the fiber, and that's what we're looking for. And that's going to give us a really nice, even black dye. So it looks a little flat right now and it doesn't look super dark, but once we hit this with the spray lacquer, this thing will be a nice, rich black. So let's go ahead and set this off to the side. Alright, so we've got the body and the leg section turned. Now we need to turn the hands, the buttons, the nose, and then the little smoking pipe. So we'll start out with the smoking pipe. And I'm using just a 1 inch by 1 inch by roughly 4 inch piece of maple, so it matches the same material that we use to turn the body and the legs out of. If you want to do contrasting materials, that'd be cool as well, but we'll just mount this in our extended pin jaws here in the VM100. To rough this down, I'm not going to be using the tailstock for support right now, because I don't want to have a dimple in the bottom of the pipe. So we'll just do some peels. And the size of the pipe is roughly going to be about that big around by maybe that tall. Let's get it close to that size and we'll see if that looks appropriate for the size of our decoration. I'm just going to clean up the end here. Now we'll go to that slicing cut. Make sure our bevel's in the direction of the cut. Alright, now let's bring this down to the size we want. I'm going to put my pencil mark back on there just for reference. That's a little big. I think that's something in between those two lines is going to work. And before I get that to the final diameter, I want to drill the hole in the side of the pipe for the stem. In the kit, it comes with a little piece of brass wire, and that's what we're going to use to attach the pipe to. So if we take a look at this one that we've already turned, we've got that brass wire with the pipe, and I want to pre-drill that just so we don't have any skating with the drill bit, or if it tears the fibers out, that way we have a nice clean hole for that brass wire. So I'm going to get my drill bit here. This is a 5/64. It's a little bit looser than I'd prefer. I would rather go with something that's a press fit, but I don't have a drill bit that small. But we'll use some CA glue to fill that in and bond that brass wire to our piece. And we'll just drill this basically right to center. Make sure you don't go too deep, because as we reduce that diameter, you might have a hole that goes out the other side. So if I take this out of the drill, we can just use that as a quick depth check. So with the overall depth, we're just a hair past center, so we should be good. Now let's get this down to the diameter that we want. Just using the long point of that skew. Basically a planing cut with the long point. I'm just going to do one more cleanup cut here on the end to get rid of our pencil mark. Alright, before we part this off, I'm just going to sand it lightly. And then the overall length of this is going to be right about there. So we can bring our tool rest back in. And we'll use the nano parting tool here. And then I'll just catch this as we part through. Trying to be gentle so I can minimize the tear out from the parting tool. So you can see that parting tool actually cut that fairly clean. There's just a little nub in the center, but that's going to be okay because I am going to put some paint on the top of this just to give it a little extra life. To get rid of that nub, we can just put some sandpaper on the lathe bed, or you can use your skew and just chisel that off. So let's set this off to the side, and then we can turn the buttons, the nose, and the hands. And then we'll basically turn, 3 same-sized buttons that we can glue onto the body, and then we'll turn a little bit smaller nose, and we'll adjust that size according to the face. So we'll get it out and just kind of test fit and make sure the size looks okay on the face. Bring this up to speed, and we don't need our tailstock for support right now. We'll do some peel cuts with that skew. Throw a small chamfer on that edge. And these buttons are going to be very small. I'd say we're going to probably shoot for something in about that diameter. And I don't want to get this whole piece down to that diameter because it's going to make it really flexible and it's going to chatter on us. So I'm going to maintain a lot of mass here in this back section. That way I don't get a lot of flex out here on the end. I'll use my narrow parting tool. I'm going to make these about 3/16 of an inch wide. Cut a small little groove there, that way I can roll this over. And this spindle gouge, it might be worth going to just a little bit smaller spindle gouge at this time, but I think this 3/8 is going to work out just fine for us. And these buttons will be flat on the back side, so that way they glue to the body and have a good mounting surface. Okay, that's going to be one of the buttons. We'll just hit it lightly with some sandpaper. So there's one of our beads, or sorry, one of our buttons. We'll go ahead and part it off. And I'm not worried about the tear out on the back side of that button. I'm just going to catch this with my finger. And these things are really small, but that parting tool leaves a little bit of a nub there. So what you can do is just get your skew and just chisel that off, being mindful not to get yourself cut. And if you need to, you can just lay it down on some sandpaper and just sand that flat. But that's going to be one of those buttons. I think that's going to look really cute on his coat. So we'll set that up off top to the side. I'm going to part down some more material here to give myself a little clearance. Start rounding this over. Get that parting tool. Just double check the length of the button I've already got. That way they're the same length. I think that's going to be good there. Just softening that round right here. And then we'll cut that nice and clean. Just lightly touch that with some 400 paper just to smooth it out. And then we can part this one off as well. I recommend once you start turning these buttons, just sweep all your shavings up. That way when you drop these on the floor, you don't lose them. There's our second button. Let's get our third one and then we'll turn the nose. And then again, we'll just lightly hold that piece and catch it as it comes off. Alright, so we've got our 3 buttons turned. We'll set these off to the side now, and we're ready to turn the nose. So we'll keep using the same material. With those buttons, they're fairly shallow, because they don't, obviously a button's usually fairly flat, but the nose is going to be a little bit more rounded. So it's going to be a little bit different shape here, but roughly about the same size. We'll make the nose about twice as tall or wide as the nose or the buttons were. And we'll do the same thing, just start using that spindle gouge to roll that. And you can turn the nose to whatever shape you'd like. Giving myself a little more clearance for my spindle gouge. Get back in there and just clean up the very end of that. I think for these little sized projects, I think the 1/4 inch spindle gouge might have been a better choice, but we made do with the 3/8. So now we're ready to sand the front of this. And we want to make sure that the back side of the nose has a flat face on it. That way it's got a good mounting surface when we go to glue it onto his face. So there's our nose, and you can see we've got that nice flat on the back. There's a little bit of a nub left behind, but we can always go to our skew and just chisel that little piece off or sand it. So now that we have the buttons and the nose turned, let's turn some hands that will mount onto the body. So we'll just extend our blank out of the chuck just a little bit further. Make sure that's nice and snug. And then we'll bring up our tool rest. And it's basically going to be the same process as turning the nose, just a little bit bigger scale. True up the blank. Go to a slice, clean up that tear out. Okay, as far as the diameter of the hands compared to the body, I think that's going to be about a good diameter for what we're looking for. So I'm going to part the first hand down to that size. Maybe make the hand just a little bit longer. And then I'm going to get rid of some of this bulk as well. Let's go back to our spindle gouge. And actually, first thing, I'm going to give myself a little bit of a groove here. That way the spindle gouge has somewhere to go into without contacting that lower wing. You can see my grip with the tools changing depending on the cuts I'm making. When I'm doing really fine, intricate detail work, I like my fingers just kind of on top of that flute, just to control that tool movement rather than having it under here. Sometimes I'll go over the rest to help support it. It just depends on what you like and what you've practiced and what you feel comfortable with. You can see because I'm left-handed, as I'm rolling this bead to the side, I have to move my body quite a ways over to the side to get out of the way of the tool. Ideally, I'd be on this side, that way I could roll that and have more free movement with my tool. But being a lefty, that's just one of the things you deal with. So, however, when I'm cutting this direction, I've got free movement with the tool. And I don't have to worry about my body getting in the way of that tool when it's trying to make the cut. Whenever you're picking up that cut, make sure you're starting with the bevel engaged, and then you can adjust the flute angle and then the tool handle position until you see a little bit of dust, and then that means you're cutting on the nose. That surface is really finely burnished. We've got a nice clean surface there, so we'll sand with that 400. I'm going to go to my smaller skew and just part the rest of this material down to the finished diameter of this hand. That way I know where I need to be as far as the diameter of the two hands so they're symmetrical. Just using that long point. Okay, that's good there. Let's use our parting tool just to give ourselves a little more of a gap. And now we can go ahead and sand the hand. We drop that speed down. On the buttons and everything, I didn't bother dropping the speed down. It's such a small piece, and we're sanding such a small area. I don't find it necessary to drop the speed much. But on this little bit bigger piece, I'm going to drop that down to about half of my turning speed. And because we're using a nice sharp spindle gouge with correct cuts, we got a really fine, clean surface with no tear out. So let's go ahead and part this hand off now. Bring that speed back up, and then we'll just catch this as it comes off. So there's the first hand, and that'll look good once we glue that on the body. I'm going to eyeball just the overall length of the hand, give myself a mark. I left myself a little bit extra than what the actual width is here just because I know I might have some tear out on this face from the parting tool, and I want to account for that. I'm just going to scribe that pencil line just a little bit darker so I can see it a little better. Grab our parting tool, give ourselves clearance for the spindle gouge. I'm going to slice this surface here, just give myself fresh timber so I know I don't have any tear out I have to fight once I start shaping this to round. Left just a little bit of a nub there. I'm gonna pick that cut up and just slice those fibers. Now we can start shaping. Bump that speed up, turning slower than I'd like. Again, this goes back to when we were doing the spindle gouge mastery video. All those different cuts we did in that video, this is where those things come into play because I've been practicing that spindle gouge a ton. I've got my cuts dialed in, so turning things like this in whatever project you're doing makes it super easy, and you're not wondering why you're getting catches, and it just makes for a more pleasant turning experience. The last thing you want is to have some gifts your wife told you to make for Christmas and you're trying to figure out how to use your tools while you're doing the project. That's a worst case scenario. I think that looks good. Go ahead and sand it now. Alright, just inspecting the surface before we part this off. You always want to give it just a nice little once over before you cut any of your pieces off, because once this is parted off, I'm not going to be able to remount it. Okay, and that's the second hand right there. So let's clean off the lathe bed. We'll get all these little parts that we need to glue on. We'll grab the body and glue those on, and then it'll be ready for a spray lacquer finish. So we'll be right back. Alright, so we have all the components turned and ready to glue on. And as I was turning the body, I had my sister paint a face on there for us. And that's going to be one of the decorative elements and creative things that you can do. So we just got some nice paint, painted a little face. And once we get it all decorated and assembled, you'll see how this comes together. But first thing we want to do is we want to lay out where we want the buttons. So I'm just going to get a pencil and I'll have those buttons basically directly in line with the mouth. And we'll just try and space these out fairly evenly. If you want to get calipers, you're more than welcome to. We'll give that a quick look, see if those button placements are going to be good, but you can see those small little pencil marks. And then for the hands, we'll have them offset, and I'm going to have these directly in line with the center button. And I think just about there is pretty good. And then I'll eyeball on this side as well, in line with that button. I'm just going to hold this up and give it a quick look over, make sure that's where I want the hands and the buttons to go. And then obviously the nose is going to go right in the center here. So I'll set this guy down. We'll be using the Fill and Finish Original. This is a little bit thicker CA, and I've got the whip tip on there. Because these buttons are so small, all we need is just a small amount of glue. So we'll start out. I'm just going to get nice and low here and support my hand on the tool rest. That way I don't get glue where I don't want it to be, because that's going to show up weird once we get a spray lacquer on this. It's going to have a weird, different colored texture to it. So I'm putting just a tiny, tiny drop of CA, and then we can put our button on. And I haven't hit it with activator, so I can still move that around and place it exactly where I want. Then we'll just give that a nice little spritz. We'll go on to our center button. Okay, we'll get that button set. And then depending on how close you are with the activator, I'm just going to keep my finger on top of that button as I spray the activator, because there's enough force in that it can push this off center. So those buttons are looking nice and in line. Now we'll do our top button. And make sure you're gluing on the buttons and not the nose randomly on accident. So I'll just set that down and then just adjust that and make sure those are all nice and in line with each other. And then we can hit that with activator. Small little dab of glue. This is when you want to be really careful. Don't have any energy drinks in the morning or too much coffee, or else you'll be a little shaky. All right, that looks pretty good. That's nice and in line with our buttons right between the eyes there. I'll just hold that nice and steady while we spray it. Okay. So there's the buttons in the nose. let's go ahead and glue on our hands now. So I'll just rotate this over to our side. And because we have a bigger mounting surface, we can put a fair bit more glue on here. And with these, I actually like to spray the back side of the button, or sorry, the hands, and then we'll place that right on. Just double check, make sure that's nice and in line with that center button. And I'll press that down as that glue kicks over. Okay, go on to this side. I'm just going to do a test fit here. I'll put the hand kind of in the center where my mark is. That looks nice and symmetrical. I think that'll be good. So we'll just rotate that over now. Go ahead and set that in place. I'm going to rotate that over and just make sure that everything is where I need it to be. And just press that down as the activator kicks over, and then we can just hit that with a little extra. So we've got the hands on, we've got the buttons and the nose. Now we're ready to do our spray lacquer finish. For our final finish, I'm just going to grab a paper towel. I do have a little bit of dust on the dyed areas of the body. I just want to make sure I wipe that off. But we are ready for our spray lacquer finish. If you're at this point and you haven't painted the face, make sure you paint that before we do the spray lacquer, because depending on what type of paint you use, it might not stick on top of a spray lacquer finish. So make sure you get all the painted features, any decorations. If you're going to do painted lederhosen like we did on this first guy, I painted that on before we did our spray lacquer. So make sure everything, decorative details are on except for the hair or any cloth or anything like that you might put onto your piece. So I'll set this guy out of the way for just a minute. And with our spray lacquer, we'll be using, this is the lacquer shot from Glue Boost. The nice thing about this is it puts out a really, really fine mist, and I don't have to really worry about getting any runs on my finish. Some of the other spray lacquers out there put out too much lacquer at a time, and they tend, they're a little more prone to getting drips and runs. I like this just because it goes on really thin, but I do need more coats because it goes on so thin. The other nice thing is because it goes on thin, I don't have to buff this after. Because this is a project I can't remount and then polish out, I need something that lays nice and flat and gives us that really good high gloss finish. So I'll put on just a couple quick sprays here, show you how I do the spray lacquer, then I'll take this outside and finish the spray lacquer process. But the biggest thing is we want to make sure that we're about 8 to 10 inches away with our spray lacquer. And make sure your can is nice and warm, depending on your shop temperature. This is preferred to be in about 70 to 85 degrees. That way it comes out nice and flat and you don't get any weird spray pattern. So once this is fully mixed up, you've shaken it really well. Make sure all those solid contents in there are nice and agitated. We'll just go about 8 to 10 inches away and we'll just lightly coat our ornament here, or our decoration. These are untreated end grain fibers, so they will pull in a lot more of the spray lacquer, so you will have to do more coats on the very top and like this surface here. But we'll just do a few coats like this, just to give you an example or an idea of how to do your spray lacquer. But you always want to make sure you wear a respirator when you're doing this. So I'll take this outside, grab my mask, and then finish getting a nice good coat on it, and then we'll come back in. All right, so we're back in the studio, and as you can see, we got the spray lacquer finish done, and we've added a lot of decorative touches. We got the face painted, we painted the nose red, we added some rosy cheeks, and for the hair and the beard, we just got some faux fur from a local hobby store. We cut that to shape, glued that on, and then we got some small little Santa hats off Amazon just to dress it up a little bit, and I think it turned out really cool. So this thing's ready to do our final assembly with the incense cup holder and the wire pipe, and then putting our incense in and getting that lit. If you get the kit from us for the German smoker, it comes with a pack of little incense you can burn. It comes with a piece of wire that will make the pipe out of here in just a second, and then it comes with the brass cup. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to cut our pipe. You can cut this depending on how long or short you want the pipe to be. I'm just going to cut that about in half. I think that's going to be plenty long for this. But we'll be gluing this into his mouth, so we want to add some curves to it. And then we're going to be gluing the actual, the cup or the bowl of the pipe here. And so we want to have some nice curves to it to make it look really cool like these other two. So we'll just use some needle nose pliers. And we'll give ourselves a nice bend to it. And then we can always cut off any excess material. Do a test fit. Obviously this piece going into his mouth is really long, but I think the height of that actually looks pretty cool. I just need to bend this up a little bit more so the cup sits flat. I'll just put this on here as a test fit. We'll set that in his mouth. I think that actually looks pretty cool. So I'm just going to cut the excess off the part that's going to sit into his mouth that we're going to glue in. And this is just brass wire, so that cuts really easy. But the next step now is to glue the wooden piece onto our wire. So let me just move this out of the way a little bit. And again, we'll be using that thick CA glue. This is the Fill and Finish Original. And we'll put just a tiny little drop using that needle applicator tip just right into that drilled hole. And we want to be careful not to put too much because it will squeeze out. And then we can set that brass wire in. Make sure that wire is lined up straight so the cup sits flat. And then we'll just hit that with some activator. Alright, so now we need to glue the pipe into his mouth. And we'll just put a small drop of glue down right in the center of his mouth. You want to be careful not to put too much glue because you can basically clog up that hole to the point where that smoke doesn't come out. And then we'll spray some activator in there. And I'll just keep this in place till that sets up. Alright, now that we've got the pipe glued in, let's glue on the cup. And the base of this is nice and flat, so we don't need a ton of glue. I'm just going to do a nice thin layer where this is going to sit. We'll get that centered up nice. And then we'll spray with just a little bit of activator. And then to use the incense, so we'll just pull one of these out. You just set that straight into the cup, and then we'll use a lighter to light this. We want to make sure we have a good even flame on here. Get this thing to where it's got a nice red ember going to it. And once that's lit, if there is a flame coming off of it, just make sure you blow the flame out, and then you can set your guy on top. And that smoke's going to filter up through that drilled hole that we drilled into the body, and it'll start coming out of his mouth. Alright, so we're done with our German smoker project, and this has just been a ton of fun. These are a great Christmas project, and it'll be a really fun tradition for you and your family. But the great thing about this project is it's extremely scalable, and you can do something really simple, or you can be really ornate, and it just depends on how much time and how much creativity you've got. So hopefully you guys learned something useful. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comment section down below. And as always, subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos.